She stood in front of the entire town. Margaret Hollis, wife of the wealthiest man in Cedar Falls, Montana, pointed one long, lacquered finger directly at Clara Bennett's face and said, loud enough for every soul on Main Street to hear, "You have no business asking a man like Wyatt Mercer anything. You're a child playing schoolteacher in a town that doesn't need you." Clara didn't flinch. Wyatt, standing 10 feet away, felt something crack open in his chest, something that had been sealed shut for 32 years. He had never married. Every person in this town had accepted that fact the way they accepted cold winters and dry summers. It simply was. Until this young woman from Boston looked him square in the eye and asked the one question nobody ever dared to ask. And God help him, he told her the truth. If you've ever loved someone in silence, afraid the words would ruin everything, stay with me. Subscribe to this channel and follow Wyatt and Clara's story all the way to the end. Hit that like button and drop your city and country in the comments below. I want to see exactly how far this story travels. Wyatt Mercer didn't talk much. That wasn't a personality flaw so much as a survival skill he'd refined over decades of living alone on land that didn't care whether you spoke or not. The cattle didn't need conversation. The fences didn't require opinions. And the town of Cedar Falls, Montana, population 412, not counting the Ridley twins who everyone knew had been quietly living in Billings since 1987, had long since stopped trying to pull words out of him that he wasn't offering. He was 54 years old. He woke at 4:30 every morning without an alarm. He ate the same breakfast, 2 eggs, cigs, black coffee, half a biscuit, if he remembered to make them the night before. And he was in the saddle before the sun broke the ridge. He paid his bills on time, he showed up at town meetings when something actually mattered, and he had exactly one friend he trusted without reservation. A blue heeler named Roscoe, who had recently developed arthritis and now walked with a limp that Wyatt privately found heartbreaking in a way he couldn't articulate. He didn't think of himself as lonely. He thought of himself as settled. That was the word he used, on the rare occasions anyone pressed him about it. Settled. It carried the right weight. It suggested intention rather than accident. It closed the conversation politely, the way you might shut a door without slamming it. Clara Bennett arrived on a Tuesday in September, which Wyatt would later mark as significant, not because Tuesday held any particular meaning, but because it was the day he had planned to spend repairing the north fence line, and instead he found himself driving into town for a bolt he'd broken that morning, which meant he was standing outside Deaver's Hardware at precisely the moment she stepped off the supply wagon from the train station. He noticed her the way you noticed weather. Not because she was remarkable to look at, though she was, in a way that caught you off guard, but because she moved differently than people moved in Cedar Falls. She moved like someone with a list of things to do and a clear intention to do all of them, carrying a leather satchel that looked too heavy for her slight frame, wearing a dress that said Boston to anyone who knew what Boston looked like, which in Cedar Falls was approximately nobody except Wyatt, who had been there once for a cattle auction and still remembered the noise of it. She stopped a woman named Doris Fitch right there on the sidewalk and said, without any preamble at all, "Excuse me, can you tell me where I find the schoolhouse?" Doris Fitch blinked. People in Cedar Falls generally worked up to questions. There were pleasantries involved, weather commentary, a certain ritual of small talk that preceded any request for information. "The schoolhouse," Claire repeated, pleasantly but firmly, the way someone repeats a sentence when they understand it was heard the first time. "Down Birch Street," Doris managed. "Past the church. Left at the Miller property. Thank you." And Clara Bennett was already walking. Wyatt watched her go without quite meaning to. He went inside and bought his bolt. He drove back to the ranch. He repaired the fence. He fed the cattle, fed Roscoe, made himself a supper he didn't fully taste, and sat on the porch in the cooling dark, and did not think about the new schoolteacher. He told himself this very deliberately. The thing about a town of 412 people is that everyone knows the new schoolteacher's business before she does. By Thursday, Wyatt had heard, without asking, that her name was Clara Bennett, that she was 22 and fresh out of a teacher's college in Massachusetts, that she had no family in Montana, that she had taken the position because, depending on who was telling it, she was either adventurous or foolish or both, and that she had already rearranged the desks in the schoolroom and requested new books from the county, which Harlan Pierce, who served on the school board, described as ambitious in a tone that made it sound like a polite word for something else. Wyatt absorbed this information the way he absorbed most town gossip, passively, without comment, while pretending to be interested in his coffee. He didn't meet her properly until the following Sunday at the Mercantile, where he was picking up feed supplies, and she was attempting to negotiate with Pete Devers over the price of lamp oil, a negotiation she appeared to be conducting with the same focused pleasantness she'd applied to extracting directions from Doris Fitch. Pete Devers was not used to being negotiated with. He was a heavy-set man with opinions and a surplus of confidence in those opinions, and the expression on his face suggested he couldn't decide whether to be impressed or irritated. Clara eventually got a 5-cent reduction on the lamp oil. Wyatt had a feeling she'd known from the start she would. She turned from the counter and nearly walked directly into him, caught herself, and looked up with a quick, measuring look, the kind of look that took in information efficiently. "Sorry," she said. "I wasn't watching." "Neither was I," Wyatt said, which was not true. She tilted her head slightly. "You're Wyatt Mercer." He paused. "You know who I am." "People talk," she said, and there was something dry and amused in it, an acknowledgement that she was aware of being talked about herself. "You have the ranch on the north edge of town. You've been here longer than most of the buildings." "About that long," he agreed. She extended her hand the way a business person extends a hand, direct, no hesitation. "Clara Bennett." He shook it. Her grip was firm. He wasn't sure why that surprised him. "I know," he said. A flicker of something, amusement, maybe. "People talk," she said again, and this time it had a different weight, an echo of his own observation back at him. He found himself wanting to say something else, which was unusual. He generally found conversations sufficient when they arrived at a natural stopping point. This one seemed to be at a natural stopping point. "How are you finding Cedar Falls?" he asked, and immediately felt the question was embarrassingly ordinary. She considered it, which surprised him. Most people gave automatic answers to automatic questions. "Honest," she said finally. "It's an honest place. That's rarer than people admit." He didn't know what to do with that exactly. He nodded, said something about the feed supplies, and excused himself in a way that he was aware was slightly abrupt. He loaded the wagon with a focused attention he didn't entirely need and drove home and sat with Roscoe on the porch, and told the dog, conversationally, that the new school teacher was unusual. Roscoe's tail moved once in a slow arc, which Wyatt took as agreement. October came in cold and certain, the way Montana Octobers always did. Clara had, by this point, thoroughly reorganized the schoolroom, established herself as someone the children both liked and were slightly afraid of in the productive way, and inserted herself into the town's rhythms with a quiet efficiency that some people found impressive and others found faintly unsettling. Margaret Hollis found it unsettling. Margaret Hollis was the wife of David Hollis, who owned the largest logging operation in the county, and she had occupied the center of Cedar Falls' social structure the way a large rock occupies the center of a stream. Everything moved around her. She had opinions about how things were done. She had opinions about who belonged where. And she had, Wyatt knew from painful experience, a particular talent for delivering those opinions with a smile that made them almost impossible to argue with directly. Clara, apparently, had not received this briefing. The confrontation happened on the second Saturday of October, which was the day of the monthly market on Main Street. Tables of preserves and produce and ironwork and leather goods, the town's particular version of community. Wyatt was there because he'd brought 3 saddles to sell and a bushel of late squash. He was not there to observe social dynamics, but social dynamics had a way of happening near him regardless. Clara had set up a small table, not to sell anything, but because she'd had the idea of collecting donated books for the school, which Wyatt privately thought was exactly the kind of idea that would either work brilliantly or create friction, depending on who got there first. Margaret Hollis got there. "Miss Bennett," her voice carried that specific pitch of sweet authority. "I noticed you didn't consult the school board before setting up here." Clara looked up from arranging the donated books someone had already brought. "I spoke with Mr. Pierce. He didn't object." "Harlan Pierce," Margaret said, as though the name explained something. "Isn't the full board?" "No," Clara agreed pleasantly. "Would you like to donate a book?" Several people nearby suddenly became very interested in preserves. Margaret's smile tightened. "What Cedar Falls needs," she said, "is a school teacher who understands her place here, not one who arrives with ideas about rearranging everything she touches." Clara set down the book she was holding. Her voice, when she answered, was still pleasant. Wyatt would later think that was the part that unsettled Margaret most. Not anger, just clarity. "I think Cedar Falls needs children who can read well," Clara said. "I'm here to help with that." "You're 22 years old," Margaret said, and her voice went somewhere colder now. "You know nothing about this town, or the people in it." "That's true," Clara said. "That's why I ask questions." Margaret turned, apparently deciding a more effective stage required a larger audience, and she found one. The small cluster of people who drifted within earshot. Her voice rose just enough. "You have no business asking a man like Wyatt Mercer anything," she said, pointing directly at Clara's face. "You're a child playing schoolteacher in a town that doesn't need you." The particular silence that follows a public cut is unlike any other kind of silence. It has texture to it, weight. Wyatt felt the eyes move to him because whatever Margaret had just referenced, and he understood what she was referencing, a conversation he hadn't known anyone had witnessed, required him to either confirm or deny something he didn't fully understand yet. Clara didn't look at him. She looked at Margaret with an expression that was almost compassionate, which Wyatt suspected was the most devastating response she could have offered. "I apologize," Clara said, "if my questions have caused you any discomfort, Mrs. Hollis." She left just enough pause after that sentence for the implication to settle in like a cold draft under a door. Margaret made a sound that was not quite a response, turned with the deliberate grace of someone making an exit, and walked away. Her husband, who had been standing 6 feet back and had clearly learned over many years to identify the precise moment when departing was wise, followed. The market noise slowly returned. Wyatt did not move for a moment. Then he walked over to Clara's table because it seemed like the thing that needed to happen. "You all right?" he asked. She looked at him. There was something in her eyes, not distress, not triumph, just the particular steadiness of someone who has absorbed something and decided what to do with it. "What did she mean?" Clara asked. "What questions?" He should have deflected. He had the tools for it. 32 years of deflection had built quite a reliable set. Instead, something in him, some closed door, some settled weight, shifted. "She probably means last Tuesday," he said slowly, "at the hardware. You asked about the schoolhouse. I was there. She was across the street." Clara waited. "She probably means the fact that you talked to me at all," Wyatt said. "People here take that as something." "As what?" He picked up a book from her table, an old, battered thing, Dickens, someone's childhood copy, just to have something to do with his hands. "I don't talk much. People know when I do." "Why don't you talk much?" He almost deflected. He felt the path of it, the smooth and practiced retreat to settled and quiet life and all the other shorthand. "Because most conversation doesn't seem worth the trouble," he said instead, and then immediately felt it was too honest by half and slightly unkind. So he added, "Except occasionally." She watched him for a moment. Not the way people usually watched him, waiting for him to finish, waiting for permission to move on. She watched him the way you watch something you're trying to understand. "Why did you never marry?" she asked. It wasn't a forward question in the way forward questions usually were. It wasn't flirtatious. It wasn't the coy probing of someone who'd heard the rumors and wanted confirmation. It was simply direct. The same directness she'd used with Doris Fitch, the same directness she'd used with Pete Devers and Harlan Pierce and Margaret Hollis. She just asked the thing she wanted to know. The book in his hands, the October cold, the market noise going on around them. Every reasonable answer he had ever prepared for this question, and he had prepared several because the question had come before, in softer forms, sat ready. Never found the right time, too busy with the ranch, just how it worked out. "I was waiting for you," Wyatt said. He heard it come out of his own mouth and felt something like vertigo, the specific kind that comes not from height, but from having said something so much more true than you'd planned to say that the air seems to rearrange itself slightly. Clara's expression didn't change immediately. And then something moved through it, not amusement, not flattery, something quieter and more complicated, something that looked almost like recognition. "That's a remarkable thing to say to someone you've spoken to twice," she said. "Yes," he agreed. "It is." She looked at him for another long moment. "Mr. Mercer," she said carefully, "I don't think you knew I existed 3 weeks ago." "No," he said, "I didn't." "So what does that mean exactly?" What you just said. He thought about it honestly, which took a moment because he was still somewhat startled by himself. I think it means, he said slowly, that I understood something when I said it that I didn't understand before I said it. She seemed to turn that over. Around them the market continued, children laughing somewhere, a horse's complaint, Pete Devers arguing cheerfully with someone about nails. That's either very profound, Clara Bennett said, or slightly alarming. Probably both, Wyatt said. Something changed in her face then, softened, maybe? Or maybe it was just that the wall he'd sensed there, the careful self-possession of someone a long way from home in a place that had just told her she didn't belong, came down just slightly. Not all the way. Not even close to all the way. But enough. I need to get back to the books, she said. I know, he said. He set the Dickens down and walked back to his saddles and stood there for 3 full minutes, thinking nothing coherent, while Roscoe, who had been sleeping under the wagon, lifted his head and watched him with the patient brown eyes of an animal who has observed his person for long enough to recognize the symptoms. This was the moment. Wyatt would know that later, not at the time, not in any clear way. But standing there in the October cold, with the strangest thing he'd ever said to another human being still hanging somewhere in his chest, he understood that his life had just divided itself quietly into 2 parts. The part before Clara Bennett asked him a question, and whatever came next. He didn't know yet that it was going to cost him more than he'd budgeted for. He didn't know yet that the walls around this town, the ones built by people like Margaret Hollis, maintained by years of settled expectation and undisturbed hierarchy, would push back against what was happening with a force he hadn't anticipated. He didn't know yet that Clara was keeping something from him, something that would change the direction of everything within 2 weeks. He just stood there in the October cold, next to his saddles and his arthritic dog, and for the first time in a very long time, he felt something he couldn't call settled. He felt awake. The telegram arrived on a Wednesday morning, 11 days after the market. Clara was in the middle of a reading lesson when young Tommy Garrett, who ran errands for the telegraph office on account of his older brother working there, appeared in the doorway of the schoolhouse with an envelope and an expression that suggested he understood, in the vague way 12-year-olds understand things, that whatever was inside it was not good news. She took it from him. She told the children to practice their sentences. She walked to the back corner of the room, by the window that looked out toward the creek, and she opened it. Wyatt heard about it the way he heard about most things in Cedar Falls, sideways, through someone else's conversation. He was at the feed store Thursday morning when he caught the tail end of what Doris Fitch was telling Pete Devers' wife about the schoolteacher's father, something about illness in Boston, and the doctor saying serious, and the particular way Doris lowered her voice on the word serious told him everything he needed to know about how serious it actually was. He didn't go directly to the schoolhouse. He went home first, fed the cattle, repaired a section of the barn door that had been bothering him for 2 weeks, ate half a sandwich standing at the kitchen counter, and then stood there in his kitchen with the afternoon light coming through the window at a low angle, and thought about Clara Bennett standing at the back of her classroom reading news about her father. He thought about that for longer than he'd have admitted to anyone. He drove to the schoolhouse at 4 o'clock after the children had gone. He knocked on the open door. She was at her desk, not grading papers or preparing lessons. She was just sitting. Her hands were flat on the desk surface in front of her, which struck him as the specific posture of someone who has been very busy managing their own reaction to something. She looked up when he knocked. "I heard about your father," he said. "I'm sorry." She looked at him for a moment. "Word travels fast." "Always has." He stepped inside, not far. "How bad is it?" She looked back down at her hands. "His heart. The doctor in Boston. My mother wrote separately from the telegram. She didn't want to alarm me with the telegram, but of course—" She stopped, pressed her lips together briefly. "She said he's stable, but they're not sure for how long. She didn't say come home in the letter. She said she was telling me so I could be informed." A pause. "Which means she wants me to come home but doesn't want to be the reason I leave." Wyatt understood mothers like that, or at least he'd heard about them enough to recognize the pattern. "When's the next train east?" he asked. She looked up. "Saturday morning, out of Billings." "That's 2 days." "I know when Saturday is," she said, and there was an edge to it, not aimed at him specifically, but it had to land somewhere and he happened to be in the room. Can you arrange for someone to take the class? Mrs. Alderman has agreed to cover. She taught here for 10 years before she retired. Clara paused. Harlan Pierce was less enthusiastic about my leaving during the term. He made that clear this morning when I asked him. Pierce makes everything difficult. Don't take it personally. He said if I left before December, he'd have to reconsider my suitability for the position. She said it flatly, the way you quote someone when you want the words to speak for themselves without any added commentary, because they're damning enough. Wyatt felt a specific irritation, the kind that settled in his jaw. He can't do that. He can do whatever the school board agrees to. She stood up from the desk, moved to straighten something on the shelf behind her that didn't need straightening. I'm going anyway. I'll sort out Pierce when I'm back. Yes, Wyatt said. You will. She turned around, and there was something almost surprised in her expression, as if she'd expected argument, or caution, or the gentler version of what Pierce had said, which was that she should consider her position before her feelings. Instead, she got two words that simply agreed with her. You're the first person today who hasn't told me what I ought to be thinking about before I make this decision, she said. You're not asking for advice, he said. You've already decided. A beat. Yes. He looked around the schoolroom briefly, the rearranged desks, the new reading chart she'd made herself with careful block letters, the donated books she'd organized by age and difficulty along the back shelf. There was a small picture pinned near the window that one of the younger children had drawn of what was clearly, despite limited artistic evidence, meant to be Miss Bennett. I'll drive you to Billings Saturday, he said. For the train. She opened her mouth. It's a long drive alone, he said, before she could offer the polite refusal he could see forming. The road between here and Billings has a section past Miller's Crossing that floods when it rains, and it rained Tuesday night, and you don't know which part to avoid. She closed her mouth, considered him. All right, she said. Thank you. He nodded and left before the conversation could become something that required more from him than he was ready to give. He spent the drive home arguing with himself in a way that would have embarrassed him if anyone could have heard it. He was 54 years old. He had never in his life done anything impulsive without accounting for the consequences. He ran a cattle operation. Everything about that required exactness, planning, the understanding that the difference between a good season and a disaster was often a single decision made at the wrong moment. He got home. He walked into the kitchen. He sat down at the table where he'd eaten alone for 32 years, and he looked at the wall opposite him, the plain, ordinary, unremarkable wall of a man's life that had accumulated exactly as much as he'd allowed it to, and he thought about Clara Bennett's hands flat on that desk. He went to bed. He lay in the dark for a long time. At some point, he stopped arguing with himself. He arrived at the schoolhouse at 6 Saturday morning with the wagon ready, and Roscoe left in the care of his neighbor, Bill Hadley, who owed him a favor from the spring and accepted the arrangement without asking questions. Clara was already outside with a travel bag, wearing a coat that was not quite warm enough for the morning, and she had that look again, the focused, forward-moving look of someone with a list and a direction. She climbed up without help before he'd fully stopped the wagon, which told him she'd been waiting longer than she'd have mentioned. They didn't talk much for the first hour. This was, Wyatt found, not uncomfortable. He'd spent enough time with people who couldn't tolerate the absence of sound to appreciate someone who didn't feel obligated to fill it. Clara sat beside him looking straight ahead, occasionally glancing at the land moving past, and he drove and said nothing and found the silence easier than most conversation. It was past Miller's Crossing when he steered them wide of the flooded section of road, and she watched the water without comment, that she finally said something. How long have you had the ranch? 28 years, he said. Bought the first parcel when I was 26. Added on twice since. That's a long time to build something. It goes faster than you think. She looked at the horizon. My father built his law practice the same way, slowly, a client at a time. He used to say the only way to build anything that lasts is to not be in a hurry about it. Wyatt absorbed that. It sounded like something he would have said, which surprised him slightly. What's he like? He asked. She was quiet for a moment, not the quiet of someone avoiding the question, but the quiet of someone considering how to answer it honestly. Careful, she said finally. He thinks things through completely before he acts. He's not a man who makes decisions with his heart. A pause. He didn't love the idea of me coming to Montana. He didn't stop me, but he wanted me to know he didn't love it. Why Montana? She glanced at him sideways. Why do you ask it like that? There are teaching positions in Massachusetts. There are, she agreed. There were 3 available when I was placed. I chose this one. Because? She was quiet again, and this time it lasted longer. Because I wanted to go somewhere that required something of me, she said. Somewhere that wouldn't be easy. I've spent my whole life doing things that were almost exactly as difficult as I expected them to be. I wanted to try something I couldn't fully predict. He turned that over. He thought about 22-year-old Clara Bennett sitting in some office in Boston, looking at 3 job placements and choosing the one that scared her most. And something in him recognized that with an almost physical sensation, the recognition of a quality he respected entirely but hadn't expected to encounter. And, he said, and Cedar Falls is harder than I expected, she said, with a dry, brief honesty. Different harder, though. Not the land or the cold, the people. Some of them. He didn't ask which ones. They both knew. Margaret Hollis isn't the whole town, he said. I know that. The children? I love the children, she said immediately, without qualification, and the speed of it told him it was simply true rather than something she'd assembled from appropriate feelings. Tommy Garrett can't read a word right now, and he's going to be reading by Christmas. I'm not leaving because of the children. You're not leaving, he said. You're going to see your father. There's a difference. She looked at him. Something moved across her face that wasn't quite gratitude. It was more like the expression of someone who's heard exactly the right thing said at the right time and isn't entirely comfortable with how much they needed to hear it. Yes, she said quietly. There is. They reached Billings with 40 minutes to spare. Wyatt tied the wagon and carried her bag because she let him, which he noted without comment. The train station was busy for a Saturday, a party of men heading to Helena for what sounded like a mining business, 2 families traveling together with a combined number of children that made the platform feel significantly smaller, and a woman in an elaborate hat who seemed to regard everyone around her as a minor inconvenience. Clara bought her ticket. They stood on the platform with the time between them and the train. He'd driven her here. He'd done what he said he'd do. The reasonable conclusion of that was to wish her safe travel, tell her the ranch would still be standing when she got back, and drive home. He heard himself say instead, I'm coming with you. The noise of the platform continued around them. Clara turned to look at him with an expression he couldn't read. You're what? She said. To Boston. He said it again, as if hearing it twice would make it feel less like something he'd pulled from thin air. I'm coming with you. Her mouth opened, closed. Wyatt, I know it makes no sense. You have a ranch. You have cattle. Bill Hadley's boy is 17 and competent. I've already spoken to him. This at least was true. He'd done that Thursday evening, told the boy he might need help for a couple of weeks, presented it as hypothetical, paid him in advance for the week, in a way that made the hypothetical feel fairly concrete. Clara stared at him. You arranged this before you told me. I wasn't sure I was going to tell you. Then why? Because I'm standing here and the train is in 40 minutes, and I'd rather explain it poorly than not say it at all. He held her gaze, which took some effort because she was looking at him with an intensity that was difficult to sustain without looking away. You shouldn't go alone. Not with your father, not knowing what you're walking into. I've traveled alone before. I know you have. I know you don't need me, he said, and said it plainly, without defensiveness. I'm not offering because you need me. I'm offering because... He stopped. Because what? Because he'd lain awake 2 nights thinking about her sitting at that desk with her hands flat and still? Because I want to, he finished, which was inadequate but true. The silence between them was different from the silence in the wagon. This one had more in it. Your ticket, she said finally. I'll buy it now if you say yes. Another long pause. A train whistle somewhere far down the line, not theirs, but close enough to remind them both that time was a real consideration. This is an unusual thing to do, Clara said. Yes, he agreed. People will talk. People talked when you asked me a question at a book table, he said. That boat has sailed. Something moved in her expression, not quite a smile, but the near neighbor of one. Wyatt Mercer, she said. I don't understand you. I'm not sure I understand myself at the moment, he said honestly. She looked at him for another 3 seconds. He counted, because it felt like 3 seconds that mattered. And then she said, Buy your ticket. and walked toward the station door. He bought the ticket. He nearly missed the train because the line at the window was longer than it should have been, and the man ahead of him had a complicated situation involving a lost bag and a claim check, and he arrived at the platform with 4 minutes to spare to find Clara standing at the train car door, looking in the direction he'd gone, with an expression she rearranged quickly when she saw him. He chose not to comment on what it had looked like before she rearranged it. The train to Chicago, and then the connection east to Boston, took the better part of 3 days with the stops and transfers. This was not a small thing. This was 60-odd hours of existing in close proximity to another person in the specific contained world of a railroad car, where you couldn't go for a walk and come back when the conversation had settled, where meals were shared in a narrow dining car, where the nights happened 6 feet apart in adjacent sleeping compartments, with walls thin enough that you were aware of another person's presence even in silence. Wyatt had not thought through all of this when he said, "I'm coming with you." He thought through it approximately 30 miles outside of Billings. He was a private man. Not secretive, there was a difference, but private. He'd spent most of his adult life in conditions of his own choosing, alone in the morning, alone in the evening, around people when necessary, but returning always to the quiet of his own company. He didn't talk about himself the way people talked about themselves. He didn't process things out loud. He held what was his and let it remain held. Clara, he discovered, was similar in some ways and entirely different in others. She was not a chatterbox. She didn't talk to fill silence. But when she did talk, she talked with a directness that had a specific effect on people, or at least on Wyatt, which was that it made evasion feel rude rather than comfortable. She asked what she wanted to know. She answered what she was asked with a precision that suggested she'd already thought about it, rather than using conversation as the place where she figured out her opinions. The first evening, in the dining car, she asked him about the ranch. Not the polite version, how many acres, how long, what do you raise? But the specific version, what he liked about it, what he found hard about it, what had gone wrong in ways he hadn't expected. He answered more fully than he intended to. The worst year was 1891, he said. Lost 30% of the herd to a bad winter and a sickness I didn't catch early enough. I'd borrowed against the north parcel to buy the extra stock, so the losses weren't just the cattle, they were the land. I spent 2 years thinking I was going to lose the whole thing. But you didn't. No, but it was close enough that I know what close feels like. He turned his coffee cup in his hands. People think ranching is, I don't know what they think. Romantic maybe, the land and the openness and all that. It's not. It's a business. It breaks things regularly. And you stayed. I stayed. Why? He considered it honestly. Because I'd built it. Not inherited it. Built it. When something's that much a part of what you made yourself out of, walking away from it would be walking away from more than land. She was quiet for a moment. My father says that about his practice, that he built himself inside of it. Smart man. He is. A pause. He's also very sure that what he built is the right shape for his children's lives, too. Wyatt looked at her. He means well, she said, quickly and honestly, not defending her father so much as insisting on accuracy. He genuinely believes the life he's built is good, and he wants good things for me. He just has a hard time imagining that good might look different than what he knows. Is that why Montana? She met his eyes. Partly, she said, and partly because I was 21, and someone told me I should be careful, and all I could think was that I was tired of being careful. He understood that. He understood it in the bones. You're 22 now, he said. I am. Still tired of being careful? She looked at him with something that was almost humor but carried more weight than humor usually did. Ask me again in a few months. The train moved through the dark outside the windows. The dining car swayed gently. Around them, other passengers ate and talked and existed in their own separate stories, and Wyatt sat across from Clara Bennett in the narrow yellow light and felt, with a clarity that was slightly alarming, that he was exactly where he was supposed to be. He didn't say that. He had already said one startling thing to this woman in a public place, and he had a policy of not averaging more than one per month. But he thought it, and thought it was true. And that was enough for now. The second day brought harder conversation. Not by design. It happened the way honest things happen, gradually, as the train crossed into a different landscape and the light changed, and something about being in motion made the usual guards feel less necessary. Clara had been quiet for most of the morning, which he'd read correctly as worry about her father gaining ground on her as the distance to Boston shortened. He didn't try to talk her out of it. He sat with it alongside her, which was its own thing, and eventually she said without looking up from the window, "What if he's worse than the letter said?" "Then you'll be there," Wyatt said. "That's not—" She stopped. "That doesn't fix it." "No. But it's the thing you can actually do, so it matters more than anything you can't do." She looked at him then. "Were you with someone when they died? Someone you loved?" The question hit somewhere in his chest that he didn't usually allow questions to hit. "My mother," he said. 19 years ago. "Were you glad you were there?" He didn't answer immediately. He thought about it with the seriousness it deserved. "Yes," he said. "Even the hard parts. Yes." She nodded slowly and went back to the window, and he saw something in her shoulders release slightly. Not all the way, but enough. I was not a man who said the right things. He knew that about himself. He said accurate things, sometimes, or honest things, but they didn't always land right, didn't always arrive in the form the other person needed. He'd spent enough time watching himself fail at this to have a realistic accounting of his limitations. But there, on that train, with the landscape changing around them, and Clara Bennett sitting across from him carrying her fear about her father with a kind of dignity that moved him, he felt something he hadn't felt in a very long time, possibly ever, in this exact configuration. He felt necessary. Not needed. She'd been clear about that. She didn't need him. But necessary, which was different. The way a particular beam is necessary to a particular structure, not because nothing else could hold, but because it was the right shape for the space. He thought about Harlan Pierce and what Pierce had said about Clara's position, and felt, quietly, a particular kind of resolve settle in him. Clara was going back to Cedar Falls. He was going to make sure of that. Not because he had any right to her choices, but because this woman, with her satchel too heavy for her frame, and her Dickens books, and her negotiated lamp oil, and her 5-cent reductions, and her fearless questions, belonged exactly where she'd chosen to be, and he was going to be damned if a school board's petty authority unmade that. He kept that thought to himself. The train pulled into the Boston station late on the third day, in the particular gray-blue dark of a northeastern evening, and Clara stood at the window as they slowed, and Wyatt saw her face change. A kind of bracing happening, a gathering of herself for whatever came next. He stood with her. He carried her bag off the train. On the platform, with the noise of a city around them and a world entirely unlike Montana pressing in on all sides, she turned to him with an expression he couldn't fully read. "My mother will be alarmed that I've brought someone," she said. "I'll manage that," he said. "You've never met my mother." "No," he said, "but I've met Margaret Hollis, and your mother, from everything you've told me, is a better person with a smaller territory. I'll manage." Clara looked at him for a moment. "You're very confident for someone who's been on a train for 3 days and needs a shave," she said. "I'm not confident," he said. "I'm stubborn. There's a difference, but from the outside they look the same." That thing that was almost a smile moved across her face again. "All right, Wyatt Mercer," she said. "Come meet my family." He picked up the bag and followed her into the crowd, into a city that was nothing like anything he knew, into whatever came next, and felt, with an absence of the doubt he expected to feel, that 32 years of building a life careful and alone had somehow, in ways he couldn't yet map, been preparation for this exact and particular moment. Clara's mother was standing on the front steps of the Bennett house on Marlborough Street when the cab pulled up, which meant she'd been watching from the window and had come out rather than wait inside, which meant she was more frightened than her letter had let on. Eleanor Bennett was a small woman with Clara's same directness in her eyes, and a composure that looked well-practiced rather than natural, the composure of someone who had learned over many years to hold difficult things without letting them show in her face. She held it now, looking at her daughter stepping out of the cab, and then her eyes moved to the man stepping out behind her daughter, and the composure adjusted itself almost imperceptibly. Clara embraced her mother first, briefly and firmly in the way of people who love each other and are not demonstrative about it. Then she turned. "Mother, this is Wyatt Mercer. He's from Cedar Falls." Eleanor Bennett looked at Wyatt with an expression that contained a number of questions she was too well-mannered to ask on the front steps in the November cold. "Mr. Mercer," she said. "Mrs. Bennett." He extended his hand. "I'm sorry about your husband. I hope he's resting well." A slight pause. He's stable, she said. The doctor was here this morning. She looked at her daughter with something that was not quite accusation but was adjacent to it. You didn't mention you were bringing company. It was a late decision, Clara said. Very late, Wyatt said, because honesty seemed like the better opening than silence. I apologize for the lack of notice. I can find a hotel if that's easier. Eleanor looked at him for a moment, the direct measuring look that he now recognized as a family trait. Come inside, she said. You've both been on a train for 3 days. The Bennett house was the kind of house that announced, without announcing, that the family inside it had built something solid over generations. Not grand, there was no performance to it, but settled in a different way than Wyatt's ranch was settled. The ranch said, I made this. The Bennett house said, this has always been here. The bookshelves in the front hallway held more books than Wyatt had seen outside a library. A coat rack by the door held coats that belonged to a man who hadn't worn them in some weeks, and Clara's eyes moved to them and then away. Eleanor showed Wyatt to a small guest room at the back of the house with a window overlooking a narrow garden that had gone brown for the season. She did this efficiently and without warmth, not unkindly, but with the careful neutrality of a woman reserving judgment. He didn't take it personally. He'd have done the same. He washed, changed his shirt, sat on the edge of the narrow guest bed for a moment, in the quiet of a house that smelled like old wood and coal heat and someone's long illness. And he thought about the fact that he was 54 years old and sitting in a stranger's guest room in Boston, Massachusetts, and found, to his mild surprise, that he didn't regret it. He heard Clara's voice through the wall, low and urgent, and then her mother's voice, and then a longer silence. He went downstairs when it seemed like enough time had passed. Edward Bennett was in his bedroom on the second floor, propped up on pillows with the specific look of a man who found his own incapacity both frightening and offensive. He was perhaps 60, with gray at his temples and Clara's same quality of stillness. And when Wyatt was brought into the room by Clara, who had the manner of someone who had decided to face something directly rather than ease into it, Edward Bennett looked at the stranger his daughter had brought from Montana with an expression that was considerably less neutral than his wife's. Mr. Mercer, he said. His voice was weaker than he'd have wanted it to be. That was clear. Mr. Bennett. Wyatt stood at a respectful distance. I'm glad to see you're sitting up. Are you? It wasn't a question. Edward looked at his daughter. You didn't write about this. There wasn't time, Clara said. And yet there was time for this gentleman to accompany you across the country. Father, I'm not criticizing. Edward's voice was dry but not unkind. I'm observing. He looked back at Wyatt. What do you do, Mr. Mercer? I run a cattle ranch, north side of Cedar Falls. How large? About 1,200 acres at present. Edward absorbed this. And you left 1,200 acres of cattle ranch to accompany my daughter to Boston. I did. During what season? Not ideal, Wyatt admitted, but my neighbor's son is competent. A silence. Edward Bennett's eyes moved between Wyatt and his daughter with the careful attention of a lawyer who has spent 40 years reading rooms. Pull that chair up, Edward said finally, nodding at the chair near the window. And tell me something true about yourself. Wyatt pulled the chair up. He sat down. He didn't look at Clara, who was standing in the doorway with an expression he couldn't fully read from this angle. I've lived alone for 32 years, Wyatt said. I'm not good at conversation and I'm aware of it. I came because your daughter was traveling alone towards something she was afraid of, and that seemed wrong to me. Edward was quiet for a moment. She was afraid, he said. She showed you that? Not exactly. He thought about how to say it accurately. She managed it well, but I could see it. Another silence, longer. Clara doesn't show fear easily, Edward said, and it wasn't a boast. It was a father saying something true about a daughter with a complex mix of pride and worry in the same breath. No, Wyatt agreed, she doesn't. Edward looked at him for a long time. Then he leaned back against his pillows with the careful movement of a man conserving energy and said, You can stay. Eleanor will have opinions about this, which you'll have to manage yourself. I'm not in a position to manage anything at the moment. I understand that. And Mr. Mercer. Edward's voice dropped slightly, not for quiet but for weight. I don't know what your intentions are toward my daughter. I'm not going to ask you directly today because I don't have the energy for the conversation that would follow. But I will ask. You should know that. I know that, Wyatt said. I'll be here when you do. He stood, put the chair back where he'd found it, and left the room. Clara was in the hallway. She looked at him with the question she wasn't asking out loud. He's sharp, Wyatt said quietly. He's a lawyer, she said. I noticed. She exhaled. Not quite relief, not quite tension releasing. Something in between. What did he say? He said I could stay. He said your mother will have opinions. She already has opinions. I gathered. Clara looked at him with that particular measuring look, and he saw something in it that hadn't been there on the platform in Billings, or in the dining car, or even in the cab from the station. Something that was working something out, some internal accounting she was doing that hadn't resolved yet. Thank you, she said, for what you said to him. I told him the truth. I know. That's why I'm thanking you. Eleanor Bennett's opinions arrived the next morning in the kitchen, which Wyatt had come down to early because old habits don't adjust for geography, and he was awake at 4:30, regardless of which state he was sleeping in. Eleanor was already there. She was making tea with the focused efficiency of a woman who'd been waking early for decades, and she looked at him when he appeared in the doorway without surprise. She'd heard him on the stairs, clearly. She poured a second cup without being asked and set it on the table across from where she'd been sitting. He sat down. She sat down. For a moment, they both looked at their cups. Clara is not like her sisters, Eleanor said, not as an opening to a longer speech, as a fact being laid on the table for examination. I don't know her sisters, Wyatt said. Her sisters married men from good families in Boston and Providence. They have houses, children, predictable lives. Eleanor wrapped both hands around her cup. I don't say this to suggest that's what Clara wants. I've accepted that what Clara wants is different, but I spent 2 months worrying about her in Montana before your telegram. There was no telegram, Wyatt said. I came on the same train she did. Eleanor looked at him. I know, I meant the telegram about Edward. After that, I worried differently. She paused. She is 22 years old, Mr. Mercer. I know how old she is. And you are? 54. Eleanor absorbed this without visible reaction, which told him she'd already done the arithmetic and had moved past the first wave of it. What is it you want from her? Eleanor asked. Not unkindly, directly. Clara's directness, he realized, had not come from nowhere. I don't know exactly, he said, and then, because that sounded evasive, he added, I know I want her to go back to Cedar Falls and keep teaching those children, and I know I want to be someone she doesn't have to manage carefully. Beyond that, I haven't worked out the specifics yet. Eleanor looked at him for a long moment. Edward asked me this morning what I thought of you, she said. What did you tell him? I told him I hadn't decided. She picked up her cup. That's still true, but I appreciate that you didn't tell me something easier. She stood, rinsed her cup, and left the kitchen with the air of a woman who had said what she came to say and would now require time to process the response. Wyatt sat with his tea and the quiet of the early morning kitchen and thought that whatever else this family was, they were not people who talked around things, and he found that quality a relief so significant it almost moved him. What? The days in Boston settled into a shape. Edward was improving slowly. The crisis had passed its worst point before Clara arrived, which was both a relief and, Wyatt suspected, a source of complicated feelings for Clara, who had crossed a continent for an emergency that had already begun to resolve. She didn't say this directly, but he saw it in the way she occupied herself, reorganizing her mother's kitchen shelving one afternoon, reading to her father in the evenings, walking the neighborhood with a briskness that suggested she was burning something off. He gave her space for all of this. He didn't insert himself. He helped Eleanor with practical things, a loose hinge on the back door, a window that had been sticking, tasks that required neither explanation nor intimacy. And he sat with Edward in the afternoons when Edward wanted company and didn't want to ask Clara for it because he knew she'd worry at the sight of him tired. Edward asked his questions on the 4th day. Not the big question, not yet, but the questions that circled it, the careful legal habit of building a case from the outside in. You've never been married, Edward said. He knew this already. Clara had told him, apparently. In 54 years. No. Why not? Wyatt sat with the question, He wasn't going to say to Edward Bennett what he'd said to Clara at the book table. That wasn't a thing you repeated to a father about his daughter without it sounding like theater. I think, he said slowly, that I kept waiting for something to feel more right than the life I had. And the life I had was decent, so the bar for more right was high. And the years went. He paused. I'm not sure if that's wisdom or stupidity. Edward was quiet for a moment. It's honest, he said. That's about all I can claim. Clara's mother thinks I should have stopped her from going to Montana, Edward said, which seemed like a change of subject but wasn't. I didn't stop her. She was determined and she was capable, and stopping her would have meant telling her that my fear for her was more important than her judgment about herself. He looked at Wyatt. I don't believe that, even when it's difficult to act on. She seems to know that about you, Wyatt said. Edward looked at the window. I want her to come home, he said quietly. It came out different from everything else he'd said. Less lawyer, more father. I want her safe and close and where I can see her. That's what I want. He paused. But what I want is not the determining consideration here, and I've known that since she was about 15 years old. Wyatt didn't say anything. She talks about those children, Edward said. Tommy Garrett, the boy who can't read. She mentioned him in 3 of her letters. She mentioned you once, briefly, in October, said the rancher at the hardware didn't talk much, and she found that interesting. A slight pause. I read that sentence 4 times. Wyatt looked at him. She doesn't mention things she doesn't care about, Edward said. That's always been true of her. The weight of that sat in the room between them. Mr. Bennett, Wyatt said carefully, I'm not going to make you promises I can't verify yet. I'm not going to tell you I'll take care of her because she doesn't need that and she'd find it insulting, and I think you know that. What I can tell you is... He stopped. Found the right words. I have never in my life gotten on a train without knowing exactly where I was going and why. That's true. It's been true for 32 years. He looked at Edward directly. I know why I got on that train. Edward Bennett looked at him for a long time. Then he said, Hand me that water glass, and the conversation moved on, and Wyatt understood that what had just passed between them was not a conclusion but a beginning, and that Edward Bennett was a man who took his time about conclusions, and that this was, in its way, a form of respect. The difficulty came on the 6th day, and it came from a direction Wyatt hadn't fully prepared for. Clara's sister arrived. Vivian Bennett Whitmore was 2 years older than Clara, married to a man in finance, and had her mother's composure and her father's precision and none of Clara's particular quality of warmth. She arrived in a cab from the South End with a hat and a look and an opinion already formed, and she managed to hold that opinion intact for approximately 4 hours before it came out in the parlor after dinner, directed at Clara in a tone that attempted to sound like concern. I'm just saying, Vivian said, and Wyatt, who was in the adjacent room but could hear clearly, recognized I'm just saying as the preamble to something the speaker knew was going to land badly. That it's a long way to Montana. Papa's health is uncertain, and I don't see why you need to go back. Clara's voice, when it came, was careful in the specific way she got careful when she was controlling something. I have a classroom. I have children who need continuity. Mrs. Alderman is covering as a temporary measure. Temporary can become permanent, Vivian said. Harlan Pierce is trying to manipulate my absence into a reason to replace me. Yes, I'm aware. Clara's voice tightened. That's exactly why I need to go back. Or, Vivian said delicately, you could let this be a graceful way to come home. Papa needs you. Mama needs help. You've had your adventure, Clara. The silence that followed that sentence had a specific quality. Wyatt recognized it as the silence of someone receiving an insult wrapped in consideration and deciding how to respond. My adventure, Clara said quietly. I didn't mean, those children are not my adventure, Vivian. The careful quality was gone. Not raised, Clara didn't raise her voice, but the temperature of it changed. Tommy Garrett cannot read. He's 12 years old and in 6 months of school. Before me, he made no progress because no one slowed down long enough to understand how he processes things differently. He is going to learn to read. I'm going to be there when he does. Clara. And the rancher in the next room, Clara said, and Wyatt went very still. Came 3,000 miles because I was traveling towards something frightening, and he decided that mattered. I don't know what to call that yet, But I know it is not nothing, and I am going back to Cedar Falls, and this conversation is finished. A chair moved. Footsteps. Clara came through the doorway into the room where Wyatt was sitting with a book he had not been reading for the last 10 minutes. She stopped when she saw his face and understood immediately that he'd heard. He expected her to be embarrassed. She wasn't. Or if she was, she moved through it quickly. Sorry, she said. Vivian means well. I know, he said. She thinks Montana is… Clara made a gesture that compressed a number of things. She thinks I'm too old for you, Wyatt said plainly, and too rough, and that you deserve something that looks more like what she has. Clara looked at him for a moment. She didn't say that. She was building toward it. A pause. Yes, Clara admitted. She was. He set the book down. She's not wrong to think it. Don't do that, Clara said sharply, and the sharpness surprised him. What? Decide what I deserve on my behalf. She sat down in the chair across from him, not gracefully, just sat, the way someone sits when they're tired and not performing anything. I've had enough of that today. He held up a hand, conceding. They sat in the quiet for a moment. What did you mean? He said carefully. When you said you didn't know what to call it yet. She looked at him. She knew exactly what she'd said and what he was asking. I meant, she said, choosing words with the deliberate care of someone who understood their weight, that something is happening that I don't have a name for yet, and I am not in the habit of naming things before I understand them. That's fair. But I know it matters, she said. I know that. She looked at her hands, not the flat, controlled stillness from the schoolhouse desk, something more unguarded. I am 22 years old, Wyatt. I know what that looks like from where you're standing. What does it look like? Like I'm too young to know my own mind. I don't think that, he said. Most people would. I'm not most people. He said it quietly, without emphasis, as a fact rather than a claim. And you are the least likely person I have ever met to not know your own mind. Something in her face shifted. The same thing he'd seen at the book table in October, that particular movement of the wall coming down slightly. Not all the way, but enough to see something true behind it. I'm scared, she said. Just that, without any architecture around it. He waited. Not of you, she said. Not of Montana. I'm scared that I've wanted something for a long time that looked like independence and freedom and choosing my own life, and I'm scared that what's actually happening is that I'm choosing a different kind of dependence without fully seeing it. Depending on someone isn't the same as losing yourself, Wyatt said. I know that in theory. I know it in practice, he said. I spent 32 years not depending on anyone, and I can tell you with some authority that it's not a system without costs. She looked at him. I'm not asking you to give up anything you've chosen, he said. I want to be clear about that. The classroom, the children, Cedar Falls, those are yours. I'm not a replacement for any of it. Then what are you? She asked. And it wasn't a challenge. It was the real question, asked with the same directness she'd used the day she asked him why he never married. He thought about it with the seriousness it deserved. I think, he said slowly, I'm the person who gets on the train. She stared at him. When something matters, he said, I get on the train. I don't know how to say it better than that. The quiet in the room changed. Not dramatically. Nothing dramatic happened. No music, no rain against the window, no particular symbolic alignment of things. Just two people sitting in a Boston parlor in November with the coal fire settling and the sounds of the street outside, and whatever was between them taking up more space than it had an hour ago. Wyatt, Clara said. Yeah. I'm going back to Cedar Falls. I know. And I'm going to deal with Harlan Pierce, and I'm going to get Tommy Garrett reading by Christmas, and I'm going to… She stopped. I need you to understand that those things come first. Not because I don't… Another stop. But because they have to. I know they do, he said. I knew that before I bought the ticket. She looked at him for a long moment, and in the looking something settled, not resolved, not concluded, but settled in the way of things that have found their proper weight. Then we go home, she said. He noticed she said we. He thought she noticed it too. Edward Bennett was sitting up in bed the morning they left, and he looked better, still pale, still careful in his movements, but with more of himself in his eyes than the first evening. Eleanor had made breakfast without being asked, which Wyatt understood was its own kind of language from a woman who expressed things through action rather than declaration. Edward shook Wyatt's hand at the bedroom door. "Mr. Mercer," he said. "Mr. Bennett. Take care of yourself on that train." He held the handshake a beat longer than necessary. And, a slight pause, the pause of a man choosing his words with care, "Thank you for being someone my daughter doesn't have to manage carefully." Wyatt looked at him. "She told me that," Edward said simply. "I don't think she knew she was saying it." Eleanor hugged Clara for longer than Clara seemed to expect, holding on with the specific grip of a mother who is sending her daughter back to a far place and choosing not to say everything she feels about it. Then she looked at Wyatt, and the look was different from the kitchen 6 days ago. Not warm, Eleanor Bennett was not a woman of rapid warmth, but something in it had moved. "You're welcome here," she said. "Not come back soon, not good luck, just, you are welcome." It was enough. They took the cab to the station in the early gray of a November morning, and Clara sat beside him this time rather than across from him, which was different in a way that neither of them commented on. And the city moved past the cab windows with its noise and its density and its entire self, and Wyatt thought about the man he'd been in Cedar Falls 6 days ago, and the man he was now, and understood that those two men were the same in most important respects, and different in at least one that would take time to fully understand. Clara had a paper in her coat pocket, a letter she'd written to Harlan Pierce on the Bennett House stationery, which she had composed at the kitchen table the evening before with a precision that Wyatt had watched and respected without interrupting. She'd read it to him when she finished. It was polite. It was also, between the lines, a document that could only be described as a declaration of intent. She was going back to her classroom. She was going back to Tommy Garrett and the reading chart and the donated Dickens books on the back shelf. And somewhere in the exact and particular space that had opened up between two people on a long train ride and in a Boston parlor and in a kitchen at 4:30 in the morning, something had taken root that neither of them had planned for and both of them could feel. Something that did not have a name yet, but was alive and growing and headed west. The train pulled into Billings on a Thursday afternoon, gray and cold, with the particular quality of Montana winter light that flattens everything and makes distances look both closer and further than they are. Clara stepped onto the platform and stood still for a moment, not moving toward the wagon Wyatt had arranged to have waiting, just standing there with the cold hitting her face and the wide sky above the station roof. "Different from Boston," Wyatt said, coming up beside her with the bags. "Completely," she said. And then, quietly, as if she was checking something internal rather than making conversation, "I'm glad to be back." He didn't say anything to that. He just picked up the bags and walked toward the wagon, and she followed, and that was its own kind of answer to something neither of them had asked directly. The drive from Billings to Cedar Falls took most of the afternoon, and the land opened up around them the way it always did past Miller's Crossing, that particular Montana expansion where the horizon pulls back and the sky becomes the dominant fact of everything. Clara watched it without comment for a long time. Wyatt drove and said nothing and let the land do what the land did, which was remind people of their actual size, in a way that was either frightening or settling depending on the person. He'd learned over the past 2 weeks that for Clara, it was settling. They reached Cedar Falls as the last light was going. The town looked the same as it always did from the North Road, the church steeple, the mercantile sign, the smoke from a dozen chimneys going straight up in the still air. Clara looked at it through the wagon, and her expression was the expression of someone seeing something clearly for the first time, even though they'd seen it before. "I need to go to the school in the morning," she said. "I know. And I need to deal with Pierce." "I know that too." She looked at him sideways. "You're not going to tell me to wait a day and rest first? Would you?" "No." "Then I'm not going to waste both our time suggesting it." The thing that wasn't quite a smile moved across her face. He was becoming familiar with it, had learned to read its variations, the difference between the one that meant she was genuinely amused and the one that meant she was grateful and didn't know how to say it. This one was the second kind. He dropped her at her rented rooms above the Alderman property, carried her bag to the door, and drove home in the full dark with Roscoe's absence from the passenger side of the wagon, reminding him that he needed to collect the dog from Bill Hadley's tomorrow morning. The house was cold when he got in. He'd been gone nearly 2 weeks, and the cold had settled into the walls the way cold does when no one has been keeping a fire. He built one in the kitchen stove and stood next to it for a while in the dark, not lighting a lamp, just standing in the warmth as it built. He was home. The cattle were fine. He'd gotten word from young Hadley through a message left at Billings. The north fence needed checking. There was a week's worth of ordinary work waiting. He stood in his kitchen for a long time before he lit the lamp. Harlan Pierce did not make it easy. This was not a surprise to anyone who had spent more than a month in Cedar Falls, but the specific shape of his difficulty surprised even Wyatt, who had known Pierce for 15 years and had a reasonably accurate internal map of the man's capacity for obstruction. Clara walked into the school board meeting on Friday evening, which Pierce had called on 48 hours' notice, which was itself a statement, and found not just Pierce, but 4 of the 5 board members arranged around the table in the back room of the Mercantile, with the specific configuration of people who have already made a decision and are going through the form of a meeting. Wyatt was there because she'd asked him to come, not for support. She'd been very clear about that, said it in a way that made it clear she didn't want him misunderstanding his role. "I want a witness," she'd said. "Someone who won't pretend afterward that things were said that weren't, or weren't said that were." He'd taken a chair against the wall. He was good at walls. Pierce opened by reading from the school board charter, which he did with the deliberate care of a man who is rehearsed. The relevant section concerned continuity of instruction and the obligations of contracted teachers, and it was written in the way of documents that were designed to be interpreted rather than read plainly. Pierce interpreted it to mean that Clara's absence, even in a family emergency, constituted a breach of her contractual obligations sufficient to require review of her position. Clara let him finish. Then she put her letter, the one she'd written at her mother's kitchen table, on the table in front of him and said, "I've outlined the specific contractual language and the exceptions provided therein. Section 4, paragraph 3 addresses medical emergencies in the immediate family. My father's cardiac event qualifies under any reasonable reading." Pierce looked at the letter. Mrs. Alderman covered adequately. Mrs. Alderman is 71 years old and covered for 11 school days as a courtesy. She is not a replacement. Clara's voice was even, precise. The children's progress during my absence is documented in Mrs. Alderman's notes, which I reviewed this morning. There are gaps that require immediate attention. The board's concern, Pierce started. The board's concern, Clara said, has been communicated to me as a threat to my position since before I left. I'd like to understand whether this meeting is a genuine review or whether the outcome has already been determined. A silence. One of the board members, a woman named Ruth Carver, who ran the dry goods with her husband, shifted in her seat. Wyatt filed that away. "That's a strong accusation," Pierce said. "It's a direct question," Clara said. "I find people sometimes confuse the two." Pierce's jaw moved. He looked down at the letter again, then at the room, then at Clara. "We'll take the documentation under consideration," he said. "The board will meet again in 2 weeks." "I'll be in my classroom Monday morning," Clara said. "The children have missed enough time." She stood, collected the copy of her letter that she'd kept for herself, and walked out. Wyatt followed her into the cold of the November evening, and they walked half a block before either of them said anything. 2 weeks, Clara said. "He wants 2 weeks to maneuver." "Ruth Carver wasn't with him," Wyatt said. She looked at him. "You noticed." "I notice things when I'm in corners. Carver's husband has 3 children in the school," Clara said, thinking it through. "She's not going to vote to replace me if I'm in that classroom doing my job." "No," Wyatt agreed. "She's not. An alderman's son is on the board. Mrs. Alderman will not want her name used as a reason to dismiss me." Clara's breath made small clouds in the cold air. "Pierce needs 3 votes. He has himself and possibly Donnelly, who does whatever Pierce suggests because Pierce helped him with a land dispute in '88. She paused. "He needs 1 more." "Jenkins," Wyatt said. She looked at him again, sharper. "You've thought about this." "I thought about it on the train," he said. "Jenkins runs the livery," she said slowly. "He doesn't have children in the school." "No, but he has opinions about people from Boston who come in and rearrange things." Clara was quiet for a moment. The cold pressed around them. "Can he be talked to?" she asked. "By me?" "Probably not. He thinks I've lost my mind." Wyatt said it plainly. "Margaret Hollis has been telling people I abandoned my ranch for a 22-year-old schoolteacher and that the whole thing is—" He paused, choosing the version that wasn't the ugliest. Undignified. Clara stopped walking. He stopped too and looked at her. Is that what people think? She asked. Some of them. And what do you think? He held her gaze. I think I went to Boston for a reason, and the reason was solid, and I'd do it again with no changes. She looked at him for a long moment in the dark street of Cedar Falls, with the cold around them and the lamplight from the mercantile window making the frost on the boardwalk glitter, and something in her face did the thing he'd been watching it do for weeks now. The wall coming down, not slowly, but in the specific way of something that has been holding too much weight and makes the decision to stop. Wyatt, she said. Yeah. I need to tell you something. He waited. When you said it on the platform in Billings, she said carefully, that you were coming with me, I wasn't entirely surprised, and I've been thinking about why that is because I should have been. I'd spoken to you perhaps 6 times. You were a near stranger. She looked at the frost on the boardwalk. But I wasn't surprised, and I think that means something that I've been not ignoring, but circling around, because it's easier to circle around it than to say it. He said nothing. He was good at saying nothing when nothing was what the moment needed. I don't circle around things, she said. That's not who I am. So the fact that I've been circling around this particular... She stopped, tried again. I care about you, in a way I didn't expect to and don't entirely know what to do with yet. That's what I wanted to say. The cold, the lamplight, the frost, the ordinary street of an ordinary town. I know, he said. She looked up sharply. You know? I've been watching you circle it for 2 weeks, he said. You're not subtle when you're circling something, even when you think you are. Something fierce crossed her face and then broke into something else entirely. Not quite a laugh, but its near cousin, surprised out of her. You could have said something, she said. It wasn't mine to say first. She looked at him. The fierce thing was still there, but softer. No, she agreed. It wasn't. They stood there for another moment, both of them slightly awkward in the way of people who have just said true things and are now in the new air of having said them. I should go home, she said. I have lesson plans to rebuild for Monday. Go home, he said. She started to turn, then stopped. Wyatt? Yeah. Jenkins comes into the mercantile on Saturday mornings, she said, alone, before his wife comes in for the weekly shopping. A pause. I thought you might happen to be there. He looked at her. Just to have a coffee, she said, perfectly even. With whoever might be around. He almost smiled. He didn't quite. I'll see what I can do. Jenkins was a difficult man in the specific way of men who mistake stubbornness for principle. He'd built the livery from nothing and was rightfully proud of it. And somewhere in the process of building it, he'd arrived at the conclusion that the values that had worked for him were the correct values for everything else, and evidence to the contrary was usually someone else's error. Wyatt had known him 20 years. They had a functional relationship based on mutual usefulness and no particular warmth, which was the basis of a number of relationships in Cedar Falls, and worked fine for most purposes. Saturday morning, Wyatt arrived at the mercantile at 8, which was when he knew Jenkins would be there, and bought himself a coffee from the pot Pete Devers kept on the back counter, and waited. Jenkins arrived at 8:15, saw Wyatt, and sat down 2 stools away with the careful distance of a man who'd heard things and hadn't yet decided what to do with them. They drank their coffee in silence for a while. Heard you went east, Jenkins said finally. Did. Long way. It was. Jenkins wrapped his hands around his cup. Margaret Hollis says, I know what Margaret Hollis says, Wyatt said. Not harshly, just factually. Jenkins was quiet. You've got 3 daughters, Walt, Wyatt said. He used the first name deliberately, not often done between them, which was why it landed. All 3 of them. You'd want them going somewhere far from home, knowing someone decent was there if it went sideways. Jenkins said nothing. Miss Bennett went to a sick father, Wyatt said. I drove her to the train because the road was flooded and she didn't know which part. And then I went with her because, he thought about how to put it, because she was 22 years old and 3,000 miles from home, and her father's heart had given out, and she would have managed fine alone, but that's not the point. He drank his coffee. You'd have done the same if it was one of your daughters. The silence lasted a while. Pierce wants her out, Jenkins said eventually. Pierce wants someone he can manage, Wyatt said. That's different. Jenkins turned his cup in his hands. My youngest can't say her letters right, he said, apparently to the counter. She went the whole last year and nobody noticed. Miss Bennett noticed in the second week. Wyatt said nothing. It's a speech thing, Jenkins said, something with how she hears the sounds. Miss Bennett, she stayed after school 2 afternoons and worked on it with Lily separate from the other children. Didn't make a thing of it, just... He stopped. Just did it. Wyatt drank his coffee. Pierce is going to call that meeting, Jenkins said. He is. He's going to need 3 votes. He is, Wyatt agreed. Jenkins stood up, put money on the counter for his coffee, pulled his coat on. Morning, Mercer, he said. Morning, Walt. Jenkins walked out. Wyatt finished his coffee and didn't let himself feel too certain about anything, because certainty was a thing you earned after, not before. The 2 weeks that followed were the hardest Wyatt could remember in recent years, which was saying something given that they were also the weeks he was behind on the ranch from his trip east. He was up before 4 every day, working until the light went, making up the ground he'd lost while simultaneously being aware of what was happening in town with a precision that was new to him. He'd never before tracked town politics as a personal matter. He found he didn't enjoy it, but he did it anyway. Clara was in the schoolroom every morning when he drove past on his way to the south pasture. He could see the lamp in the window from the road. She'd gotten there before the children. He could tell by the angle of the light. He didn't stop. He drove past, and that was enough. She'd told him she cared about him, and he'd said, I know, and they hadn't spoken directly about it since, which could have been awkward but wasn't, or not entirely. There was an understanding between them that had been arrived at without being formally agreed to, the way 2 people who have been through something real together sometimes arrive at things. Not by conversation, but by the fact of having been in it together and come out the other side changed in the same direction. He thought about what to say to her. He thought about it the way he thought about most things he needed to do right, carefully, unhurriedly, with attention to what would actually be true rather than what would sound good. He was not a man who made speeches. He knew this about himself. But there was something he needed to do, and it needed to be done in the right place, and the right place was becoming clear to him in the way that right places sometimes did. Not as inspiration, but as simple, obvious recognition, the kind that makes you feel slightly foolish for not having seen it from the beginning. The board meeting happened on a Thursday evening, 3 weeks after they'd returned. Pierce called it to order with the particular self-satisfaction of a man who believes he's already won. He had his documentation. He had Donnelly, who sat beside him with the expression of someone who has been told what to think and has accepted this as efficient. And he had his argument, which he delivered at some length with an attention to procedural language that might have been impressive in a courtroom, but in the back room of a Montana mercantile mostly made people shift in their seats. Then Ruth Carver said, quietly, that she had visited the schoolroom that week and reviewed Mrs. Alderman's notes alongside Miss Bennett's current lesson documentation. And in her view, the children's progress was not only unharmed, but more advanced than she'd seen in the school in 10 years. Alderman's son said his mother had expressly asked him to relay that she found Miss Bennett's method sound, and her dedication exceptional, and that she, Mrs. Alderman, would not be comfortable having her temporary tenure used as grounds for anything. Jenkins looked at the table and said, I vote to retain. The math was against Pierce, and Pierce knew it. He pushed the procedural language another 10 minutes before the vote was called. Clara was retained 4-2. Pierce and Donnelly against. Carver, Alderman's son, Jenkins, and the 5th member, a farmer named Holt, who hadn't said a word the entire meeting but voted with the quiet decisiveness of a man who had made up his mind before he walked in favor. Clara walked out of the meeting and into the cold street, and Wyatt fell into step beside her. 4-2, she said. Yes. Jenkins. He mentioned Lily's letters, Wyatt said. I didn't bring it up. She looked at him. What did you say to him? I asked him what he'd want if it was one of his daughters. She was quiet for a moment. That's it? She said. That's usually enough, if the right question, he said. They walked for a while in the cold, past the church, past the lit windows of the houses where Cedar Falls was having its Thursday evening, families at supper, lamps burning, ordinary life continuing in ordinary ways. I want to show you something, Wyatt said. She looked at him. Now? If you're not too tired. She was tired. He could see it in the way she'd been holding her shoulders since the meeting. But she said, "All right." He drove her to the schoolhouse. Not inside, outside. He stopped the wagon in front of the steps, the same steps she'd climbed on her first Tuesday in Cedar Falls in September. The same door she'd walked through every morning since, with her too heavy satchel and her reorganized desks and her donated books and her reading charts. He got down from the wagon. She got down on her own, because she always did. He stood on the bottom step, which put them closer to the same height than they usually were, and he looked at her in the dark with the cold around them and the lamplight from the street reaching only partway to where they were standing, and he thought about 32 years of a settled life and a Tuesday in September and a bolt he'd broken on a fence post and the specific way a woman had walked down a wagon track carrying a satchel like she had somewhere important to be. "I'm not good at this," he said. "At what?" "Saying things in the right way." She looked at him steadily. "You've been saying things in the right way for 2 months," she said. "You might be underestimating yourself." "Maybe." He held her gaze. "Clara." "Yes." "I know you said you don't name things before you understand them," he said. "And I know 22 years old is not—" He stopped, tried again. "I know there's a gap between us that people will count and have opinions about. I know your father is in Boston, and your life here is still not settled yet, in the sense of fixed and certain. I know all of it." He paused. "I know it, and it doesn't change what I want to ask you." She was very still. "I want to marry you," he said. "Not because I've lost my mind, and not because I don't understand the complications, and not because I have some idea of you that isn't who you actually are. Because I know exactly who you are." He said it plainly, the way he said everything he meant completely. "You're the person who negotiated the lamp oil down 5 cents and wrote a legal brief at your mother's kitchen table and stayed after school for Lily Jenkins' letters without telling anyone. You're the person who asked me the question nobody in 32 years bothered to ask." He paused. "I don't want you to give up a single thing you've chosen. The classroom, the children, this town you're building something in. All of it stays yours. I'm just asking to be in it." The wind moved through the space between them. Somewhere down the street, a door opened and closed. Clara looked at him for a long time. "That's a remarkable thing," she said, "for a man who's not good at saying things." "I had time to think on the train," he said. Something moved through her face, not the small, near smile, not the careful, composed look. Something more open than either. Something he hadn't seen before, which moved him more than he'd have expected. "I'm going to keep teaching," she said. "I know. And I'm going to have opinions about the ranch and how things are run, and I won't always be wrong. I expect that. And I'm going to write to my father, and he's going to want to come here and inspect the situation and form his own conclusions." "I hope he does," Wyatt said. "I liked your father." "He liked you?" she said, and something in the way she said it suggested this had been confirmed directly, and the confirmation had mattered to her. A pause. "Wyatt Mercer," she said. "Yes." He hadn't moved. He still didn't move because he wasn't sure quite what he'd do if he did, and this was not a moment for uncertainty. "Yes," she said again, as if once wasn't quite sufficient to hold what she meant by it. He reached out and took her hand, and she let him, and they stood on the schoolhouse steps where a question had been asked on a Tuesday in October, an ordinary question from a person who wasn't afraid to ask what she wanted to know. And everything that had come from it stood around them in the cold Montana dark, like something real and built, and theirs. The town found out the following morning, because in Cedar Falls nothing remained private past breakfast. Doris Fitch told 4 people before 9 o'clock. Pete Devers expressed the opinion, to anyone who'd listen in the hardware store, that it made a certain sense when you thought about it, though he hadn't thought about it until now. Ruth Carver stopped Clara on her way to the schoolhouse and embraced her with the warmth of a woman who had voted correctly and wanted credit for the fact, and Clara accepted this graciously. Margaret Hollis was seen leaving the Mercantile mid-morning without completing her usual shopping, which was noted and interpreted correctly. Bill Hadley, who had kept Roscoe for 2 weeks and had asked no questions about anything, shook Wyatt's hand with the grip of a man who had been waiting to do this and said only, "About time," which contained in 2 words everything that needed saying about 32 years of Wyatt Mercer's settled life. Roscoe was indifferent to all of it, which was the correct response. By afternoon, the schoolhouse children had somehow gotten word. Children in small towns have a network for information that operates faster than any telegraph. And Tommy Garrett, who had spent the morning successfully reading an entire paragraph aloud for the first time in his 12 years, looked up at Miss Bennett with the specific expression of a child who has just learned something and isn't sure what to do with it. "Miss Bennett," he said carefully, "is it true you're going to marry Mr. Mercer?" Clara set down her chalk. She considered the correct pedagogical response to this question, which was not to discuss her personal life in the classroom. "Yes," she said. "It is." Tommy Garrett looked at her for a moment. Then he looked back at his reader with the satisfied expression of someone filing information correctly. "Good," he said, and turned the page. Outside the schoolhouse window, November was doing what Montana November did, going dark early, going cold without apology, making the light that was left feel more valuable for its scarcity. Inside, 14 children sat at their rearranged desks with their donated books and their new reading charts, in the classroom of a woman who'd come 3,000 miles because she was tired of doing things that were almost exactly as difficult as she expected them to be. And down the North Road, past Miller's Crossing, past the section where the road flooded in the rain and you had to know which part to avoid, a rancher who hadn't talked much in 32 years drove home to a house that was about to become something other than quiet, with a blue heeler in the passenger seat and exactly one clear thought in his head. He was not waiting anymore. The wedding was set for the second Saturday of April, which gave Cedar Falls 4 months to form opinions about it, and Cedar Falls used every one of those months productively. The opinions divided roughly into thirds. 1/3 of the town was genuinely happy about it. This group included Ruth Carver, Bill Hadley, most of the families with children in the school, and Tommy Garrett's mother, who had stopped Clara on the street in December and held both her hands and said nothing for a full 10 seconds, which communicated everything. Another third was neutral in the specific way of people who have no stake in something but enjoy watching it unfold. The final third had reservations, and Margaret Hollis was the organizing principle of those reservations, though she'd learned since October to be more careful about where she expressed them and in front of whom. Harlan Pierce had gone quiet after the board vote in a way that Wyatt recognized as the quiet of a man regrouping rather than conceding. He hadn't done anything visible through December or January, which meant he was doing something invisible, and Wyatt waited for it the way you wait for weather you can feel coming before you can see it. It arrived in February, in the form of a letter to the school board from the county education office in Helena, raising questions about the credentials of contracted teachers who intended to change their legal name and marital status mid-contract, and whether such changes required a review of the original terms of employment. The letter was careful and bureaucratic, and had Pierce's fingerprints all over it without his name appearing anywhere. Clara read it at the kitchen table of the ranch house. She'd been spending evenings there with increasing frequency since December, working on lesson plans while Wyatt dealt with accounts at the other end of the table, and Roscoe occupied the space between them with the democratic ease of a dog who had accepted the new arrangement without any particular adjustment period. She read the letter twice, set it down, picked up her coffee. "He went to Helena," she said. "He wrote to someone in Helena," Wyatt said, "or had someone do it for him." Same result. She turned the letter over as if the back might contain something useful. "Married women teaching. This is going to be his argument." Wyatt was quiet. He knew she was right. Several counties had policies, not laws, but policies, which were almost worse because they were less clear, that complicated the employment of married women in public teaching positions. Pierce had found the lever he'd been looking for, and he'd found it at the county level where Wyatt's conversations with Jenkins and Carver carried no weight at all. "I need to write to my father," Clara said. Wyatt looked at her. "Not because I can't handle it," she said immediately, reading his face. "Because he's a lawyer, and he knows how these letters work, and I want to know if it has any legal standing before I respond." "That's sensible," Wyatt said. She looked at him. "You thought I was going to say I needed my father to fix it." "For about half a second," he admitted. Something moved through her expression, not quite irritation, not quite amusement, the particular mix of the two that he'd come to recognize as her response to being known well enough to be caught. "I'm going to fix it," she said. "I just want the right tools." Edward Bennett's response arrived 10 days later, 4 pages in his careful lawyer's hand, analyzing the county letter with the precision of someone who had been reading documents designed to intimidate for 40 years. The county letter had no enforceable legal basis, Edward wrote. Montana state law in 1893 contained no prohibition on married women in contracted teaching positions. The county office could raise questions but could not act unilaterally against a contracted employee without cause, and a change in marital status was not cause. What Pierce had done was send a letter designed to make Clara doubt herself, and the correct response was a letter in return that made absolutely clear she had read it with full understanding and was not impressed. Edward had drafted that letter too. It was attached. Clara read it at the kitchen table, and when she finished, she sat back in her chair with a long exhale that released something she'd been holding since February. "Your father," Wyatt said, "is occasionally exactly what's needed," she finished. She sent the letter to the county office the following morning, with copies to each school board member delivered by hand. Harlan Pierce received his copy on a Thursday. He did not respond to it, and he did not raise the issue again, and the particular silence that followed had a different quality than his earlier silences, less regrouping, more retreat. Ruth Carver told Doris Fitch, who told everyone else, that Pierce had looked noticeably deflated at the March board meeting, which was the most satisfying piece of information to travel through Cedar Falls in several months. Edward and Eleanor Bennett arrived from Boston on the 1st of April, 4 days before the wedding. Wyatt met their train in Billings with the wagon, which Eleanor looked at, and then climbed into with the composure of a woman who had decided to accept Montana on Montana's terms, a decision Wyatt suspected had cost her some internal negotiation. Edward looked better than he had in November, color in his face, movement easier, the cardiac event receding into something he carried rather than something that was actively carrying him. He shook Wyatt's hand on the Billings platform with a grip that was stronger than it had been in that Boston bedroom, and looked at him with the direct eyes that Clara had inherited in full. "You're thinner," Edward said, "than I expected a rancher to be." "Winter's been hard," Wyatt said. "I'll put it back on in spring." "Montana agrees with Clara," Edward said. It wasn't a question, but it had a question inside it. "It does," Wyatt said. "She agrees with it too." Edward nodded slowly, and that was the extent of the conversation about feelings on the Billings platform, which suited both of them fine. The drive back to Cedar Falls was easier than Wyatt had expected, because Edward was a man who observed rather than performed, and Montana in early April, still cold but with the first suggestions of green in the low ground, the sky doing what the Montana sky did when the light started coming back, gave Edward considerable material to observe. He asked questions about the land and the cattle operation with the specific interest of someone who builds things and recognizes the architecture of something else built carefully. Wyatt answered fully, which he did not always do with people he was still learning to trust. But Edward Bennett had earned a particular kind of directness in that Boston bedroom, and Wyatt was not a man who forgot how credit was accumulated. Eleanor sat beside Clara in the wagon bed, and Wyatt could hear them talking in low voices behind him. Not the words, just the rhythm of it, something different from the measured exchanges he'd observed in Boston. Easier. Clara's voice had a quality in it he didn't hear in other conversations. He thought about the fact that in 4 days he was going to marry this woman, and felt something that was not quite nerves and not quite peace, but somewhere between them. The particular internal weather of a person about to do the most important thing they've ever done, and being absolutely clear-eyed about that fact. Vivienne arrived the following day from Boston with her husband, whose name was George and who turned out to be a quiet, watchful man who said little, observed everything, and shook Wyatt's hand with the look of someone suspending judgment as a deliberate act of fairness. Wyatt respected that. He'd rather be fairly evaluated than politely accepted. Vivienne had clearly done some internal revision since November. She was not warm toward Wyatt. Warmth was not her natural register regardless. But she was civil in a way that felt genuine rather than performed, and when she watched Clara in the kitchen of the ranch house that evening, something in Vivienne's face moved that told Wyatt she was seeing something in her sister she hadn't expected to see. Clara was laughing, not the careful, controlled, near smile, actually laughing at something Tommy Garrett's mother had said. She'd come to help with the preparations because Clara had become close with several of the families over the winter in the particular way of teachers who are fully present with their students' lives. And the laugh was unguarded and real, the laugh of a person who is entirely where they're supposed to be. Vivian looked at Wyatt from across the room, and the look said something she would never say directly, which was, "I see it now." He gave a small nod, which said, "I know." That was the end of whatever remained between them. The wedding was not elaborate. Clara had been specific about this from the first conversation, not from false modesty, but because she had a clear sense of what mattered and what was decoration, and decoration without purpose struck her as a waste of attention. The ceremony was held at the Carver place, which had the largest front room in town, on a Saturday morning with the April light coming through windows that Ruth Carver had polished for the occasion. The justice of the peace was a man named Overton, who had been marrying people in Cedar Falls for 20 years and had learned to read the room. He kept it short and honest, which was what both of them wanted. Wyatt stood at the front of the Carver front room in the best clothes he owned, which were decent but not remarkable, and watched Clara come through the door on her father's arm and felt something in his chest that he was not going to try to name in a room full of people because it would have required sitting down. She wore blue, not white, which some people noted and some people didn't. It was the color she'd chosen because it suited her and she knew it, which was a perfectly sufficient reason in her view. She looked like herself, which was the thing he'd been most afraid she wouldn't, that the occasion would smooth something essential out of her. It hadn't. She walked with the same forward-moving certainty she'd carried off the supply wagon on the first Tuesday of September, and her eyes found his immediately and stayed there, and she looked like a woman who has made a decision she is entirely at peace with. He was aware that he was smiling, which was not his most natural expression in public. He couldn't help it. Edward placed Clara's hand in Wyatt's, with the deliberate care of a man doing something that costs him something real, and doing it anyway, because love that doesn't release is not love, but possession. And Edward Bennett understood the difference even when it was hard. They said what needed to be said. Overton kept his word about brevity. At the part where Wyatt was meant to speak his piece, he said what he'd prepared, which was not long, and contained these words. "I spent 32 years building something I was proud of. I didn't know until September that it was missing its most important part. I won't make that mistake again." Clara's expression did the thing he loved most, which was to go entirely still for a moment and then come fully alive. She said her part, which was her own, and which she'd written herself and not shown him beforehand, and it contained this. "I came to Montana because I wanted something that would require everything I had. I didn't know I'd find a person who required the same of himself. That's the thing I'm most grateful for." The room was quiet in the way rooms get quiet when something real has been said in them. Then Overton said the words that made it legal, and Wyatt kissed his wife, and Cedar Falls made the noise that rooms make when something long in coming has finally arrived. The spring that followed was the hardest and best of Wyatt's life, and he would say so directly if anyone asked, which in Cedar Falls a number of people did. Hard because two lives combined are not automatically harmonious, and neither Wyatt nor Clara had the temperament to pretend when something wasn't working. They disagreed about the ranch accounts in April. Clara thought he was undercharging for the spring cattle, and he thought she was applying Boston market logic to Montana reality, and they had the argument fully and not quietly and arrived at a middle position that turned out to be closer to Clara's than his, which he acknowledged because it was true. They disagreed about the spare room in May. Clara wanted it for a study. Wyatt had been using it for storage for 15 years, and the storage lost. They disagreed about Roscoe sleeping in the bedroom, which Wyatt had allowed for years on the grounds that the dog had arthritis, and the floor was cold, and Clara had no objection to the dog, but did have an objection to a 60-pound animal taking up a third of the bed, and a compromise was reached involving a cushioned bed on the floor beside the wood stove, which Roscoe accepted with the philosophical ease of a creature who understands that circumstances change. These were not small things when they were happening. They were the ordinary friction of two people learning to share a life, and the friction was real and sometimes uncomfortable and produced heat that they both had to manage carefully. What made it work, and Wyatt thought about this often, in the particular early morning quiet that was still his, still 4:30, and the darkness before sunrise, was that neither of them was pretending. Clara did not pretend to be easier than she was, and he did not pretend to be more flexible than he was. And somehow the honesty of that made the friction navigable. You can find your way through real difficulty. It's the pretended difficulty, the surface smoothness covering unspoken resentments that eventually breaks things. He'd watched enough marriages in Cedar Falls over the years to know the difference. Tommy Garrett read his first full book in May. It was a short book, 40 pages, intended for younger children, but Tommy was 12 and had never read a complete book in his life. And when he finished the last page, he sat for a moment and then looked up at Miss Bennett. She was still Miss Bennett in the classroom, which had been her condition, and which the children had accepted with the adaptability of the young, with an expression that contained something too large for his face to fully hold. "I read it," he said. "You did," Clara said. "The whole thing. Every word." He looked back down at it. Then he said quietly to the book rather than to her, "I didn't think I could." Clara put her hand briefly on his shoulder. Not long, she was not a demonstrative teacher in the way of some, but enough. "I knew you could," she said. "That's why I waited." Wyatt heard this story from Clara that evening, told at the kitchen table in the factual way she reported things that had moved her deeply, because she processed emotion through precision rather than expression. But he could hear what it had meant to her in the careful way she chose her words, and he sat across from her in the kitchen of a house that had stopped feeling like a man's solitary life and started feeling like something else entirely, and felt grateful in a way he didn't have good language for. He'd stopped needing language for everything. That was new too. The summer brought the Bennett parents for a second visit, shorter, easier, Edward moving better, and Eleanor arriving with slightly less composure management required than in April, which Wyatt took as progress. Edward walked the north pasture with Wyatt on the second morning, the two of them moving at Edward's pace rather than Wyatt's, which was slower but gave them time to talk in the manner they'd established in Boston, directly, without unnecessary preamble. "She's happy," Edward said. He said it the way he said things in that Boston bedroom, as an observation being filed rather than a sentiment being expressed. "I believe so," Wyatt said. "She'd tell me if she wasn't." "Yes," Edward agreed. "She absolutely would." He stopped to look out over the pasture, the summer grass going gold at the edges where the sun hit it, the cattle moving slowly in the middle distance. "This is not what I imagined for her." "I know." "It's better," Edward said, "than what I imagined." He paused. "I want you to know I see that." Wyatt looked at him. "I spent 30 years imagining a specific shape for my daughter's lives," Edward said, "because I thought I knew what safety looked like. And I did know, for two of them. But Clara—" He stopped, started again. "Clara needed a different shape. I couldn't build it for her, and I didn't know what it was." He looked at the cattle. "You didn't build it for her either, I understand that. But you're in it, and she built it herself." "She did," Wyatt said. "That's the right order," Edward said quietly. "I understand that now." They stood for a while in the summer morning, two men who had come to something honest after an unlikely route, and Wyatt felt the particular satisfaction of having been seen clearly by a person whose opinion he respected, not the relief of approval, which was different and cheaper, but the deeper thing of recognition. By the following September, a full year since Clara had stepped off the supply wagon on a Tuesday morning with her satchel and her Boston dress and her terrifying directness, Cedar Falls had rearranged itself around the fact of Wyatt and Clara Mercer in the way that towns eventually do. Margaret Hollis had not become warm, but she had become quiet on the subject, which in Cedar Falls passed for acceptance. Harlan Pierce had not attended the wedding and had not been specifically missed. Jenkins stopped Wyatt at the Mercantile in August and said, without preamble, that Lily had read a full passage aloud at the dinner table the previous Sunday, and his wife had cried, and Wyatt said that was good to hear, and Jenkins said yes it was, and that was the entirety of it, and it was enough. The school opened its second year with Clara in September to 14 returning students and 3 new ones, including a 6-year-old girl from a family that had come from Idaho who arrived on the first day with the specific terror of a child in a new place, and Clara crouched down on the schoolhouse steps to the girl's level and said, "I'm Miss Bennett. I've been waiting for you," which was something she said to all the new children and which the girl, whose name was Pearl, accepted with the solemnity of someone receiving important information. Wyatt, driving past on his way to the south pasture that morning, saw it through the wagon, Clara on the steps, the small girl beside her, the door of the schoolhouse open behind them. He didn't stop. But he slowed, briefly, and looked, and felt something move through him that he'd been trying to find language for all year without quite succeeding. He thought about what 32 years of a settled life had looked like. The 4:30 mornings alone. The kitchen that smelled of coffee and no one else. The conversations he'd avoided because they'd seemed not worth the trouble. The wall he'd built around himself that he'd called settled because it sounded better than what it actually was, which was afraid. Not of specific things, not of work or weather or loss, which he'd faced in various forms, but of the particular vulnerability of wanting something you couldn't control. Of being known by another person completely and having them leave or stay, and either way being exposed. He'd been 54 years old before someone asked him a question he couldn't deflect, and his answer had startled him because it was true in a way he hadn't known yet, the way some true things are. You say them before you understand them, and then you spend months understanding what you said. I was waiting for you. He'd said it as a confession, and it had turned out to be a description. He had been waiting. Not for Clara specifically, he hadn't known her, couldn't have known her, but for the thing she represented, which was the possibility that the life he'd built with such care was a foundation rather than a conclusion. That 54 wasn't the end of building, but the beginning of building differently. He thought about how close he'd come to not going into Deaver's Hardware that Tuesday morning. A different bolt. A repair made the day before. Any small change, and he drives to town on Wednesday or Thursday, or not that week at all, and Clara steps off the supply wagon and he's in the south pasture and the question never gets asked. He'd thought about this more than was probably useful. But it led him somewhere that mattered, which was this. The life you're living is made of 1,000 accidents and choices so small you don't notice making them. And most of the time you can't tell which ones matter until much later, and often you can never tell at all. What you can do, the only thing really, is pay attention when something real presents itself and not let the habit of your own fear make the decision for you. That was harder than it sounded. He knew that from the inside. In October, Clara told him she was pregnant. She told him at the kitchen table, in the morning, in the direct way she told everything, not built up to, not softened, just said. She was watching his face when she said it in the manner of someone who wants accurate data rather than performed reaction. He sat with it for a moment. "How are you?" he said. "Surprised," she said, and she considered. "Not afraid exactly, aware that I don't know what this is going to require." "Neither do I," he said. "That's honest. It's all I've got." She looked at him across the table. Outside the kitchen window, the October morning was doing what Montana October mornings did, cold and clear and demanding. Roscoe was asleep by the wood stove. The ranch was making its usual sounds, the sounds that had become the sound of his life, in a way that now included her and was better for it. "Wyatt," she said. "Yeah." "I'm glad it's you," she said simply. He reached across the table and took her hand, the same hand he'd taken on the schoolhouse steps in November, and held it. "Me too," he said. The daughter was born the following June, on a morning that had not cooperated in any of the ways you might hope a birth would cooperate, and Clara was not graceful about the difficulty of it. She was fierce and exhausted and said several things. Wyatt chose not to record in any mental permanent file, and afterward she lay in the bed of the room they'd made ready in February and held the child with the look of someone who has arrived somewhere after a very long trip and is only now beginning to understand where they are. They named her Nell, not after anyone, just Nell, because Clara said it was a name that could belong to a person rather than a legacy, and Wyatt agreed. Nell Mercer was born with her mother's dark eyes and, Wyatt thought, possibly his stubbornness, though Clara said she would reserve judgment on that point. She grew in the way children do, urgently, messily, with no concern for the convenience of the people responsible for her. She learned to walk by pulling herself up on the kitchen table, which was not the first piece of furniture she damaged. She spoke early, in full sentences that startled visitors because of their precision, which surprised no one who knew her mother. She had by the age of 3 declared strong opinions about the cattle, the color of the schoolhouse door, and Roscoe, whom she loved with the totalizing love of a small child for an old dog. Roscoe, for his part, endured this love with a patience that Wyatt found genuinely moving, the patience of an animal who has watched his person long enough to understand what matters. The year Nell was 4, on a September afternoon that was warm in the particular way of late Montana summer. Before the cold remembers itself, Wyatt and Clara sat on the bank of the creek that ran along the north edge of the property and watched their daughter play at the water's edge. Nell was engaged in a project that seemed to involve moving rocks from one location to another for reasons she had not explained and apparently did not feel required explanation. She was talking to the rocks, or possibly to the water, with the focused conversational energy of someone who has a lot to say. Clara was sitting with her knees drawn up, looking at the creek and the child and the light on both. She had a letter from her mother in her pocket. Edward had had a second cardiac episode in the spring, milder than the first, and was recovering again, and Eleanor had written with the steady, measured language of a woman managing fear through information. Clara had read it twice on the porch this morning and then folded it and put it away with the care of someone placing something in the right compartment. Wyatt sat beside her, close enough that their arms were touching, which was the posture they'd arrived at over the years. Not demonstrative, just present. "She's going to be trouble," Clara said, watching Nell explain something to a particularly large rock. "She already is," Wyatt said. "I mean specifically at school, when she starts. She's going to ask questions that the lesson plan doesn't account for, and she's going to be right, and the teacher is going to have to manage it." "The teacher should be used to that," Wyatt said. Clara glanced at him sideways. "I'm not going to teach my own daughter. That's a conflict of interest." "Then whoever teaches her will need to be good." "They will," she said, in a tone that communicated she would have opinions about this when the time came, strong ones, delivered directly. Nell had moved from rocks to water, crouching at the creek's edge and conducting what appeared to be a careful inspection of the moving surface, occasionally reaching one hand in and then pulling it back with an expression of scientific evaluation. "Wyatt," Clara said. "Yeah. Do you ever think about—" She paused, started differently. "6 years ago you were sitting alone in this ranch and Roscoe had arthritis and you needed a bolt for a fence post." "I think about that more than is probably useful," he said. She was quiet for a moment, watching Nell. "I almost didn't take the Montana placement," she said. He looked at her. "There was a position in Connecticut, a town school closer to my parents, more structured, familiar." She turned the grass between her fingers. "I looked at it for 2 weeks before I chose Montana, and even then I wasn't sure. I was on the train to the Boston station to buy my ticket, and I almost got off at the wrong stop and went home." "What kept you on?" She thought about it honestly, the way she thought about everything. "I didn't want to be the person who got off," she said. "I didn't want to find out, at 40, that I'd taken every safe choice I was offered and missed." She gestured at the creek, at Nell, at the September afternoon and all it contained. "This." He absorbed that. "I was afraid," she said. "Every step of it. The train, the town, the question I asked you, Boston, the board meetings, all of it. I was afraid the whole time." "You didn't look it," he said. "I know," she said. "That's different from not feeling it." He thought about what he'd realized driving past the schoolhouse in September, about fear and its habit of making decisions on your behalf if you let it, about the wall he'd called settled for 32 years, about all the questions he hadn't let himself ask, because the answers might require something of him. "The thing about fear," he said slowly, "is it tells you you're heading towards something that matters. The things that don't matter, those you don't fear." Clara looked at him. "So the fact that we were both afraid," he said, "probably means we were both right about this." She held his gaze for a moment with the look he knew best, the real one, the fully present one, the one that had no performance in it. "That is either very profound," she said, "or slightly alarming." He recognized those words. She did too. He could see it in the way something moved through her face, the echo of a Tuesday in October, a book table, a bolt for a fence post, a question no one had thought to ask until she did. "Probably both," he said. She smiled then. Not the near smile, not the controlled version, the real one, full and unguarded in the September afternoon light. Nell had turned from the creek and was looking at them with the evaluating expression she used when she was trying to understand adult behavior, which she found frequently puzzling. "What are you doing?" she demanded. "Sitting," Wyatt said. "Why?" "Because it's worth doing," he said. Nell considered this with the seriousness of a 4-year-old receiving philosophical instruction. Then she turned back to the creek, apparently satisfied, and resumed her project. Clara leaned her head briefly against Wyatt's shoulder. Not long, just a moment, the particular gesture of someone marking something without making a speech of it. He thought about all the lonely seasons, the long winters alone in a house built for one, the 4:30 mornings with no sound but the cattle and the wind and Roscoe's slow breathing, the 32 years of building something he was proud of that had turned out to be a foundation. He thought about a Tuesday in September and a woman with a satchel too heavy for her frame, moving through a town with the certainty of someone who had somewhere important to be. He thought about a question asked at a book table in October, and an answer that had surprised him out of his own mouth, and how sometimes the truest things are the ones you say before you fully understand them. Every lonely season had been real. The difficulty of it had been real. He wasn't going to pretend it had all been preparation and therefore easy, because it hadn't been easy, and life isn't preparation. Life is just life, accumulating in the directions you allow it to go. But he was here. In the September afternoon beside the creek, watching his daughter talk to the water with her mother's precise vocabulary and his stubborn insistence on finishing whatever she started. And beside him, the woman who had asked him one question and changed the direction of everything, and the answer he'd given her was still true, was more true now than it had been then, which he hadn't thought possible. He had been waiting. He hadn't known it until she made him say it. And everything after, the train, the frost, the board meetings, the arguments over ranch accounts, the October mornings, and the June birth, and the difficult, beautiful, ordinary accumulation of a shared life. All of it had been the answer proving itself true, one day at a time, in the specific and unrepeatable way that real things prove themselves. Not perfectly, not smoothly, not without cost or friction, or the occasional morning when the gap between two people feels wider than usual and requires work to cross. But truly, and truly, he had learned, was enough, was more than enough, was in the end the only thing that lasted. Nell picked up a rock from the creek bed, examined it with her mother's evaluating eye, and placed it with great care in a position that apparently satisfied some internal architectural logic. "Good," she said, to the rock or the creek or the afternoon. Wyatt Mercer, who had not talked much for most of his life, looked at his daughter and his wife and the clear Montana Creek running past the north edge of land he'd built his life on, and found, as he had found every morning for the past 5 years, that he had nothing to add to that. Good. That was exactly right.